July 7, 2000. Minsk National Airport. A cameraman pulls into the parking lot just after midnight, his trunk loaded with professional equipment. He's there to pick up his colleague, a journalist returning from a story abroad. It's a routine pickup, the kind that happens 1,000 times a day at airports around the world. Except this time, the cameraman never makes it inside the terminal. His car is found hours later, abandoned, engine cold, doors locked. His equipment still in the trunk. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, no body, no ransom, no explanation. His name was Dzmitry Zavadski, and he disappeared into a void so complete, so absolute, that 2 decades later, investigators still argue about what happened in that parking lot. Was he kidnapped, murdered, disappeared by the state? The official investigation has produced no arrests, no charges, no closure. Just silence. The kind of silence that breeds conspiracy. The kind that makes people whisper. Because Dzmitry Zavadski wasn't just any cameraman. He had filmed things that powerful people didn't want filmed. He had documented protests, captured government crackdowns, worked alongside journalists who asked dangerous questions in a country where dangerous questions could get you killed. And in the months before his disappearance, Belarus was becoming a very dangerous place to ask questions. So, what really happened at Minsk National Airport that night? Why would a cameraman vanish while doing something as mundane as picking up a colleague? And why, after all this time, does his case remain one of the most disturbing unsolved disappearances in European history? The answers might be hidden in the shadows of a government willing to silence its critics. Or they might be somewhere else entirely. Because when you start pulling at the threads of Dzmitry Zavadski's disappearance, the entire fabric of Belarus in the year 2000 begins to unravel. Dzmitry Viktorovich Zavadski was born on November 2, 1971, in Hrodna, a city in western Belarus near the Polish border. It was a city of old architecture and older suspicions, a place that had changed hands between empires more times than its residents cared to count. Growing up in the final years of the Soviet Union meant growing up in a world of contradictions. Official optimism masking economic decay, public loyalty hiding private doubts. Those who knew Dzmitry as a child remember a boy with an intense curiosity about how things worked. He was fascinated by technology, by cameras, by the mechanics of capturing reality on film. While other kids were playing football in muddy yards, young Dzmitry was often found tinkering with radios or helping his father repair household electronics. His mother would later recall that he had an almost obsessive need to understand things completely, to take them apart and put them back together until he knew every component. This wasn't just idle curiosity. It was a personality trait that would define his entire approach to journalism. Dzmitry believed that truth existed in the details, in the small mechanical pieces that most people overlooked. He applied this philosophy to everything, from operating a camera to understanding political situations. Nothing was too minor to examine. Nothing was too obvious to question. By his teenage years, Belarus was transforming. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and suddenly the rigid certainties of his childhood were replaced by chaos and possibility. The new Belarus was supposed to be democratic, independent, free. For a brief moment, anything seemed possible. Dzmitry watched this transformation with the eyes of someone who had learned not to trust surfaces, who looked for the mechanisms underneath. He was a quiet young man, not given to grand political statements or revolutionary rhetoric. Friends from his university years describe him as thoughtful, analytical, someone who listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was with precision. He chose his words carefully, never overstating, never exaggerating. This made him trusted. People knew that when Dzmitry Zavadski said something, he meant it exactly. After completing his education, Dzmitry gravitated naturally toward television journalism. Not as an on-camera reporter, he was too reserved for that, but as a cameraman. Behind the lens was where he belonged, where his eye for detail and his technical precision could combine with his growing interest in documenting reality. He started working for state television, learning the craft, understanding the rhythms of news production. But state television in Belarus was becoming something troubling. By the mid-1990s, Alexander Lukashenko had been elected president, and the brief democratic experiment was ending. Lukashenko consolidated power quickly, brutally, methodically. State media became propaganda.
Journalists who questioned the government found themselves unemployed, harassed, or worse. Independent media outlets were shut down. Cameras that filmed the wrong things were confiscated. Dzmitry watched this happen, and at some point, he made a choice. He left state television and began working with independent journalists, with foreign news agencies, with anyone who was still trying to document what was actually happening in Belarus, rather than what the government claimed was happening. It was a dangerous choice. It was also the only choice that made sense to him. By 1999, Dzmitry was working regularly with Russian public television, known as ORT. He was their cameraman in Belarus, filming stories that the Belarusian state media wouldn't touch. Political protests, economic hardship, government corruption. He became known among foreign journalists as reliable, skilled, fearless. When they needed footage from Belarus, they called Dzmitry. He had married by then.
His wife, Svetlana, understood the risks of his work, but also understood that asking Dzmitry to stop would be like asking him to stop breathing. This was who he was, someone who documented truth, who believed that bearing witness mattered, even when it was dangerous. They had a young son together. Dzmitry adored the boy, played with him whenever work permitted, dreamed about the kind of country he might grow up in. But he was increasingly aware that his work was making him a target. In private conversations with colleagues, he had begun to express concern. Not paranoia, exactly, Dzmitry was too rational for paranoia, but a growing sense that he was being watched, that his phone might be tapped, that the footage he was filming was creating powerful enemies. He wasn't wrong.
To understand why Dzmitry Zavadski disappeared, you have to understand the Belarus of 2000. You have to understand what kind of country it had become, and what kind of man was running it. Belarus in 2000 was often called Europe's last dictatorship, and the label wasn't hyperbole. Under Alexander Lukashenko, the country had regressed into authoritarianism at a speed that shocked even those familiar with post-Soviet politics. Lukashenko had come to power in 1994 promising to fight corruption and restore order. Within 2 years, he had rewritten the constitution to give himself near absolute power. Within 4 years, he had crushed the opposition, muzzled the press, and turned Belarus into a surveillance state. The capital, Minsk, was a city of wide Soviet-era boulevards and brutalist architecture, a place that felt frozen in time. KGB headquarters still operated under that name, unapologetically, long after other former Soviet republics had rebranded their secret police. The state controlled everything: media, industry, agriculture, education. Dissent was not tolerated. Political opponents didn't just lose elections, they disappeared. And disappearances had become a pattern. In 1999 alone, several prominent opposition figures and journalists had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Yuri Zakharenko, former Minister of Internal Affairs turned opposition politician, disappeared in May 1999.
Viktor Gonchar, a former vice president of the Belarusian parliament, vanished in September 1999 along with businessman Anatoly Krasovsky. All three men were critics of Lukashenko, all three were last seen in Minsk, none were ever found. The official investigations into these disappearances went nowhere. The government claimed ignorance. Human rights organizations claimed government involvement. International pressure was ignored. Belarus, under Lukashenko, operated according to its own rules, and one of those rules seemed to be that critics could simply cease to exist. This was the environment Dzmitry Zavadski was working in. This was the soil from which his disappearance would grow. The media landscape was particularly treacherous. Independent newspapers were shut down on technicalities.
Journalists were harassed, arrested on fabricated charges, or beaten by unknown assailants. Foreign reporters were expelled. The message was clear: document the official narrative or face consequences. Dzmitry had chosen to face the consequences. But it wasn't just about press freedom. Belarus in 2000 was also dealing with economic crisis, political isolation, and growing accusations that its security services were operating as criminal enterprises. There were rumors, persistent, detailed rumors, that elements within the government were involved in arms trafficking, money laundering, and contract killings. Some of these rumors pointed to a special unit, an elite squad allegedly tasked with protecting state security through any means necessary. Later, much later, after Dzmitry's disappearance became international news, A former member of this unit would come forward with explosive allegations. But in July 2000, these were just whispers, just speculation. Just the kind of thing that people who lived in Belarus learned not to talk about too loudly. This was the world Dzmitry navigated daily. A world where filming the wrong thing could make you an enemy of the state. Where asking the wrong question could end your career, or your life. And he knew it. His colleagues would later say that in the months before his disappearance, Dzmitry had become more cautious, more aware of surveillance, more careful about where he went and who he spoke with. The weeks leading up to July 7, 2000, were busy for Dzmitry.
He was working on multiple stories, juggling assignments from different news organizations, trying to keep up with the relentless pace of events in Belarus. The country was in turmoil. Economic conditions were deteriorating. Protests were erupting and being violently suppressed. Every day brought new footage to capture, new stories to document. In late June, Dzmitry had filmed a story about economic hardship in rural Belarus. He spent several days in small villages, documenting the collapse of collective farms, interviewing people who hadn't been paid in months, capturing the quiet desperation of a country falling apart. It was powerful footage, the kind that made government officials furious because it was undeniably true.
He had also been working with Pavel Sheremet, a prominent Belarusian-Russian journalist who was investigating corruption at the highest levels of government. Sheremet was exactly the kind of journalist that authoritarian regimes hate, charismatic, fearless, and relentless. He asked questions that made powerful people uncomfortable. And Dzmitry was his cameraman, the person who made sure those uncomfortable questions were captured on film. In early July, Sheremet traveled to Kaliningrad for an assignment. The plan was simple. Dzmitry would pick him up at Minsk National Airport when he returned on July 7th. It was a routine pickup, something they had done dozens of times before. There was no reason to think this time would be any different. But there were small details in those final weeks that, in retrospect, seem ominous. Dzmitry mentioned to his wife that he felt he was being followed. Nothing concrete, nothing he could prove, just a feeling. Cars that seemed to appear too often. Faces that looked familiar in crowds. The subtle pressure of surveillance. He had also made comments to colleagues about needing to be more careful. Not specific threats, not direct warnings. Just a general sense that the work they were doing was becoming more dangerous. Some of his friends suggested he take a break, maybe leave Belarus for a while. Dzmitry dismissed the idea. This was his country. This was his work. Running wasn't in his nature. On July 6th, the day before he disappeared, Dzmitry spent time at home with his family. Neighbors would later report that nothing seemed unusual. He played with his son in the yard. He had dinner with his wife. He made plans for the weekend. Small, ordinary plans that suggested a man expecting to have a future. That evening, he prepared his equipment. As a cameraman, Dzmitry was meticulous about his gear. Everything had to be checked, cleaned, organized. He loaded his camera equipment into the trunk of his car, a white Volkswagen Golf. He double-checked the battery levels, made sure he had extra tapes, verified that everything was in working order. Pavel's flight was arriving after midnight, and Dzmitry wanted to be ready to film if there was a story at the airport. Before he left the house, he kissed his wife goodbye. It was late, nearly 11:30 p.m., and she was already in bed. "I'll be back in a few hours," he told her. Just a routine pickup. Just another airport run. Those were the last words Svetlana ever heard him speak. July 7th, 2000, began just after midnight. Pavel Sheremet's flight landed at Minsk National Airport at approximately 12:30 a.m. He collected his luggage and made his way through customs, expecting to find Dzmitry waiting in the arrivals area, camera ready, already thinking about their next story. But Dzmitry wasn't there. At first, Sheremet wasn't concerned. Flights run late, traffic happens. Parking can be difficult. He waited, checking his phone, scanning the crowd for his cameraman's familiar face. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Sheremet called Dzmitry's mobile phone. No answer. He called again. Still nothing. This was unusual. Dzmitry was reliable to the point of obsession. If he said he would be somewhere, he was there, usually early. Missing a pickup without explanation wasn't like him at all. Sheremet asked airport staff if they had seen a cameraman matching Dzmitry's description. No one had. He checked the parking lot,
thinking maybe Dzmitry's car had broken down. He found nothing. Growing uneasy, he tried the phone again. It rang and rang, but no one picked up. By 2 a.m., Sheremet's unease had turned to genuine concern. He called Svetlana Zavadskaya, waking her with the news that her husband had never shown up at the airport. She was confused, then worried. Dzmitry had left the house hours ago. He should have been there. Where was he? She tried his phone. No answer.
She called again and again, listening to it ring into the void, each unanswered call amplifying her fear. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Sheremet made a decision. He contacted the police, reporting a missing person. The initial response was dismissive. A man missing for a few hours, probably just a misunderstanding. Maybe car trouble, maybe he stopped somewhere. File a formal report in the morning. But Sheremet knew better. He knew what kind of country they lived in. He knew what had happened to other journalists, other critics, other people who had become inconvenient to the government. He insisted. The police eventually agreed to send someone to check the airport. What they found was both mundane and terrifying. Dzmitry's white Volkswagen Golf was in the airport parking lot, right where you would expect it to be. The car was locked, the engine was cold, suggesting it had been parked for hours. And here's the detail that makes everything worse. Dzmitry's camera equipment was still in the trunk. His professional gear, the tools of his trade, the expensive equipment he treated with almost religious care, all of it was still there, untouched, abandoned. A cameraman doesn't abandon his equipment, not willingly, not voluntarily. Not unless something has gone catastrophically wrong. The scene told a story, but it was a story with pages missing. Dzmitry had arrived at the airport. He had parked. He had locked his car, and then nothing. No signs of struggle. No blood. No witnesses. No body. No clues. He had simply ceased to exist between his car and the terminal entrance, a distance of maybe 200 meters. By dawn, Svetlana was at the airport, frantic, demanding answers that no one could provide. Where was her husband? What had happened? Why wasn't anyone looking for him? The police were conducting a search, they told her. They were investigating. They would find him. But even as they spoke these reassurances, something felt wrong about the official response. The police seemed to be going through the motions, rather than conducting an urgent search. Questions were asked slowly. The crime scene wasn't secured properly. Hours were allowed to pass before any serious investigative work began. Svetlana stood in that parking lot as the sun rose, looking at her husband's car, seeing his camera equipment in the trunk, and understanding with horrible clarity that Dzmitry Zavadski had not simply vanished. He had been taken. The investigation into Dzmitry Zavadski's disappearance was compromised from the beginning. Not through incompetence, though there was some of that, but through something far more sinister. Because if elements within the Belarusian government were responsible for his disappearance, then the investigation was being conducted by the same people who had made him vanish. The official investigation was handled by the Belarusian prosecutor's office and the Ministry of Internal Affairs. On paper, they did everything correctly. They interviewed witnesses. They examined the car. They reviewed airport security footage. They followed leads. But somehow, despite all this activity, they found nothing. No suspects. No motive. No evidence of what had happened. Airport security cameras had captured Dzmitry's car entering the parking lot shortly after midnight. The footage showed him parking, getting out of the vehicle, and locking it. Then he walked toward the terminal. And then, according to official reports, he simply disappeared from the camera's view. No footage of an abduction. No footage of a struggle. No footage of anything unusual at all. This absence of evidence became the foundation of the official narrative. Dzmitry Zavadski had disappeared of his own accord. Perhaps he had personal problems. Perhaps he had debts. Perhaps he had fled the country. The investigation explored these possibilities with what seemed like enthusiasm, as if eager to blame the victim rather than find the truth. But the problems with this narrative were obvious. Dzmitry had left behind his camera equipment, worth thousands of dollars, in his car. He had left behind his family without warning. He had left behind his entire life. And he had done all this while supposedly heading into an airport terminal to pick up a colleague. None of it made sense. Pavel Sheremet became an unofficial investigator, driven by guilt and fury. He gave interviews to international media, describing the disappearance, demanding answers, refusing to let the story die. He pointed out the obvious, that Dzmitry was a journalist who had filmed things the government wanted hidden, and now he was gone. The connection was not subtle. Human rights organizations took up the case. The Committee to Protect Journalists issued statements. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe demanded a proper investigation. International pressure began to build. The Belarusian government responded with indifference, bordering on contempt. President Lukashenko, when asked about Zavadski and other disappeared journalists, suggested they might have been killed by criminals or might have fled the country. The message was clear. The government didn't know and didn't care. As weeks turned into months, the investigation produced no results. No arrests, no charges, no explanation. Dzmitry's family held out hope that he might still be alive, that he might be in a prison somewhere, that eventually he would come home. But that hope grew thinner with each passing day. The Belarusian authorities did make one significant move. They declared that Dzmitry Zavadski was the victim of a crime, confirming that they believed he had been abducted. But they claimed to have no idea who was responsible or what had happened to him. This official acknowledgement of a crime, combined with their complete failure to solve it, only deepened suspicions about government involvement. Because here's what investigators found, or rather, what they claimed to find. Nothing. No witnesses who saw anything suspicious. No forensic evidence at the scene. No digital trail. No paper trail. No communication records that suggested anything unusual. It was as if professionals had orchestrated the disappearance. People who knew exactly how to avoid leaving evidence. Who understood how investigations worked. Who had access to resources that ordinary criminals couldn't possess. The kind of professionals that governments employ. International media descended on the story. CNN, BBC, and major European outlets all covered Zavadski's disappearance, linking it to the earlier disappearances of opposition politicians. A pattern was emerging, a systematic elimination of people who threatened Lukashenko's grip on power. The public response in Belarus was muted, not from lack of caring, but from fear. People understood that drawing attention to the case could be dangerous. Still, small protests were organized. Flowers were left at the airport parking lot where Dzmitry's car had been found. His photograph appeared on posters demanding justice. His wife, Svetlana, became a reluctant public figure, giving interviews, pleading for information, refusing to accept official silence as an answer. The emotional toll on the family was devastating. Svetlana was left in a state of agonizing uncertainty. Her husband wasn't confirmed dead, but he wasn't alive either. He existed in a limbo that made grief impossible and hope torturous. Their son grew up without a father, with only photographs and stories to remember him by. Other journalists covering the case began to experience harassment. Pavel Sheremet received threats. His apartment was broken into, though nothing was stolen. Other reporters found their phones tapped. Their movements followed. The message was unmistakable. Investigating Zavadski's disappearance was dangerous. In 2001, something extraordinary happened that would transform the case from a mysterious disappearance into an international scandal. A former officer from an elite unit within the Ministry of Internal Affairs came forward with explosive allegations. His name was Yuri Goravsky, and his testimony was chilling. Yuri Goravsky claimed to have been part of a special squad, an off-the-books unit that operated under the direct authority of senior government officials. According to Goravsky, this unit's purpose was simple and horrifying: to eliminate enemies of the state, not arrest them, not charge them with crimes, eliminate them. Goravsky provided detailed testimony about the unit's operations, naming names, describing methods, revealing the existence of what was essentially a government death squad operating inside Belarus. He claimed the unit was responsible for the disappearances of Yuri Zakharenko, Viktor Gonchar, and Anatoly Krasovsky, the opposition figures who had vanished in 1999. And he claimed they were responsible for Dzmitry Zavadski's disappearance. According to Goravsky's account, Zavadski had been targeted because of his journalism, specifically his work documenting government corruption and human rights abuses. The decision to eliminate him had been made at the highest levels. The operation at the airport had been carefully planned and professionally executed. Zavadski described how such operations typically worked. A target would be abducted by operatives who knew how to avoid security cameras, how to leave no evidence, how to make someone disappear without a trace. The victims were usually killed quickly, their bodies disposed of in ways that made discovery unlikely. Some were buried in remote forests, others were cremated, some simply ceased to exist, their remains scattered or hidden so thoroughly that they would never be found. This testimony was explosive. It suggested that Dzmitry Zavadski hadn't been killed by criminals or disappeared by accident. He had been murdered by his own government, by people sworn to protect citizens, by a regime willing to kill journalists for doing their jobs. The Belarusian government denied everything. Zavadski was called a liar, a fantasist, a criminal seeking attention. His testimony was dismissed as fabrication. No investigation was launched based on his allegations. No one was arrested. No one was charged. But Zavadski's claims were detailed and specific. He named commanding officers. He described the unit's structure. He provided information that could be verified, and in several cases, was verified. International investigators found his account credible. Human rights organizations believed him.
Journalists who had covered Belarus for years found his testimony consistent with everything they had learned about how Lukashenko's regime operated. The problem was proof. Zavadski's testimony was evidence of a crime, but it wasn't enough to secure convictions. The people he named denied involvement. The Belarusian courts, controlled by the government, refused to pursue the cases. And without access to crime scenes, without bodies, without physical evidence, prosecuting anyone was impossible. Still, Zavadski's revelations transformed international understanding of the case. Dzmitry Zavadski wasn't just a missing journalist anymore. He was a victim of state-sponsored murder, a man killed for documenting truth, a casualty of a regime willing to do anything to maintain power. As the investigation continued, or rather, as the official investigation continued to produce nothing, alternative theories emerged. Some were plausible, others were absurd. All of them reflected the deep uncertainty surrounding the case. One theory suggested that Zavadski had been killed by criminals with no connection to the government. Perhaps he had witnessed something at the airport, some smuggling operation or criminal activity, and was killed to silence him. This theory had the advantage of being possible, but it suffered from logical problems. Why would criminals risk abducting someone in an airport parking lot? Why would they leave his expensive camera equipment behind? And why would the investigation into such a crime be so thoroughly unsuccessful? Another theory proposed that Russian intelligence services were involved. Dzmitry worked for Russian television, and the geopolitics between Russia and Belarus in 2000 were complicated. Perhaps he had become entangled in some intelligence operation, or had filmed something that Russian authorities wanted suppressed. This theory was even less convincing than the criminal hypothesis. It required assuming a level of Russian involvement in Belarusian affairs that, while not impossible, seemed needlessly complex. A third theory suggested that Zavadski had staged his own disappearance. Proponents pointed to the lack of evidence of a struggle, the seemingly voluntary parking of his car, the absence of witnesses. Perhaps he had fled Belarus for political asylum elsewhere, leaving behind a mystery to protect his family from retaliation. But this theory collapsed under scrutiny. Dzmitry's passport was never used. He never contacted his family. No evidence of him living elsewhere ever emerged. And most damning, he had left his camera equipment behind. A cameraman fleeing persecution takes his tools. The most credible theory remained the simplest, that Dzmitry Zavadski had been abducted and murdered by Belarusian security services on the orders of senior government officials, exactly as Zavadski had testified. This theory explained everything: the professional execution, the lack of evidence, the failed investigation, the pattern of disappearances, the targeting of journalists and opposition figures. It explained why the case remained unsolved, because those responsible for solving it were the same people responsible for committing it. Several investigative journalists have attempted to reconstruct what might have happened that night, based on Zavadski's testimony and other available evidence. The scenario they describe is chilling. Dzmitry arrives at the airport shortly after midnight. He parks his car and begins walking toward the terminal. Operatives, who have been watching him or who have been tipped off about his movements, intercept him somewhere between the parking lot and the terminal entrance. They identify themselves as security personnel, not an unusual sight at an airport. They tell him he needs to come with them for questioning.
Dzmitry, not wanting to cause a scene, complies. He's led to a vehicle and driven away. Within hours, he's dead. His body is disposed of, buried somewhere remote or destroyed entirely. The operatives return to the airport and ensure that any security footage showing the abduction is either confiscated or erased. The whole operation takes a few hours at most. By the time Pavel Sheremet lands and realizes something is wrong, Dzmitry Zavadski has already ceased to exist. This scenario is speculation, but it's informed speculation based on testimony from someone who claims to have participated in similar operations. And it fits the facts better than any alternative explanation. The details that won't let go are the ones that haunt investigators and family members alike. The camera equipment. Why leave it? If this was a staged disappearance, if Dzmitry had fled, why abandon thousands of dollars worth of professional gear? And if he was abducted, why didn't the abductors take the equipment? Was it left behind as a message, a taunt, or simply because the operatives didn't care about cameras? They cared about silencing the cameraman. The timing. Why that night? Why that specific moment? Was it opportunistic, or had the operation been planned in advance? If planned, who knew that Dzmitry would be at the airport at that time? His colleagues knew. His wife knew. But who else? Had his phone been tapped? His movements monitored? Had the regime been waiting for the perfect moment, when he would be isolated, vulnerable, far from witnesses? The security footage. Airport security cameras should have captured everything. Modern airports are surveilled constantly, obsessively. Yet according to official reports, the cameras somehow missed the critical moments. They showed Dzmitry walking toward the terminal, and then nothing. No abduction, no struggle, no suspicious vehicles. Either the cameras failed at precisely the wrong moment, a remarkable coincidence, or the footage was altered or destroyed. Given the pattern of government control in Belarus, the latter seems far more likely. The witness silence. Minsk National Airport wasn't deserted that night. There were other travelers, airport staff, security personnel. Someone must have seen something. Yet no witnesses ever came forward. No one reported seeing Dzmitry being approached or led away. The silence is eerie, suggesting either that there truly were no witnesses, which seems improbable, or that anyone who saw something understood that speaking up would be dangerous. The investigation's failures. Every lead went nowhere. Every piece of potential evidence turned out to be meaningless. Every witness had nothing to report. The statistical probability of an investigation being this thoroughly unsuccessful by accident approaches zero. Either the investigators were staggeringly incompetent, or they were deliberately sabotaging their own work. Given that Belarusian security services are known to be professionally competent, incompetence seems unlikely. There's also the question of Dzmitry's work in the days before his disappearance. What had he been filming? What stories was he working on? His colleagues mentioned that he had been documenting economic hardship and government corruption. Were there specific officials he had embarrassed? Specific operations he had exposed? The details of his recent assignments were never fully disclosed, leaving open the possibility that he had stumbled onto something particularly damaging to the regime. And then there's the broader pattern. Dzmitry wasn't the first journalist to disappear in Belarus, and he wasn't the last. In 2004, Veronika Cherkasova, another journalist critical of Lukashenko, was found dead under suspicious circumstances. In 2011, Ale Biabenin, founder of an independent news website, was found hanged in what authorities called suicide, but what colleagues suspected was murder. The pattern of journalists dying or disappearing in Belarus extends across decades, suggesting not isolated incidents but systematic suppression. What haunts those familiar with the case most is the thought of those final moments, Dzmitry walking across the parking lot, probably thinking about the pickup, about Pavel's flight, about what story they might work on next. Maybe he noticed the men approaching, maybe he didn't. Maybe he felt a moment of fear before they identified themselves, maybe he believed, right until the end, that this was some kind of misunderstanding that could be cleared up. Or maybe he knew immediately what was happening. Maybe he understood, in that instant, that all his caution hadn't been enough, that the regime had finally decided he was too dangerous to tolerate, that his years of documenting their crimes had earned him this particular fate. Maybe he knew he was going to die. We'll never know what he thought. We'll never know if he had time to think anything at all. Where does the case stand now, more than 2 decades after Dzmitry Zavadski walked into that parking lot and never walked out? Officially, the investigation remains open. The Belarusian authorities periodically issue statements claiming they're still searching for answers, still following leads, still committed to solving the case. But no progress has been made in years. No new evidence has emerged. No arrests have been made.
The case file gathers dust, a prop in a performance of justice without substance. Svetlana Zavadskaya has become an advocate for other families of disappeared persons in Belarus. She has given countless interviews, attended international human rights conferences, and refused to let her husband's case fade into obscurity. She still doesn't know where Dzmitry's body is buried. She still can't properly mourn because there's no grave to visit, no place to leave flowers, no physical confirmation that her husband is truly gone. Their son has grown up in his father's absence, knowing Dzmitry only through photographs and stories. He has become a symbol of the cost of authoritarianism, of what happens to families when governments believe they can murder with impunity.
Pavel Sheremet, the journalist Dzmitry was supposed to pick up that night, continued reporting on Belarus and other post-Soviet states. He never stopped talking about Zavadski's disappearance, never stopped demanding accountability. In 2016, Sheremet himself was killed by a car bomb in Kiev, Ukraine. The murder remains unsolved, though many suspect it was connected to his journalism. The symmetry is almost unbearable. The journalist who disappeared, and the journalist who came to pick him up, both silenced by violence, both denied justice. International pressure on Belarus regarding disappeared journalists has waxed and waned over the years. When attention is focused elsewhere, the Lukashenko regime operates with complete impunity. When international organizations remember the cases, there are statements and resolutions and demands for accountability, but they rarely produce results. Belarus has learned to weather such pressure, to wait it out, to rely on the world's short attention span. Yuri Goravsky, the former security officer whose testimony implicated the government, has lived in exile since coming forward. He has repeated his allegations multiple times, provided additional details when asked, and maintained the consistency of his story across more than 2 decades. He has never recanted. The Belarusian government has never seriously addressed his claims. In recent years, there have been attempts to bring the case before international courts. The European Court of Human Rights has ruled that Belarus violated its obligations to investigate Zavadski's disappearance properly. The court ordered Belarus to pay compensation to the family. Belarus has refused. The ruling is symbolically important, but practically meaningless. You cannot enforce justice against a government that doesn't recognize the authority of international law. Some hope for resolution has come from regime change elsewhere. When authoritarian governments fall, archives sometimes open, witnesses sometimes talk, truth sometimes emerges. But Lukashenko remains in power in Belarus. He has survived protests, international sanctions, and internal dissent. He controls the archives, he controls the witnesses, he controls the truth, or at least the official version of it. There's a graveyard somewhere in Belarus, or maybe several graveyards, scattered across the country's forests and fields, where the regime's victims are buried. Unmarked graves, hidden locations, places that might never be found. Somewhere in one of these graves, investigators believe, are the remains of Dzmitry Zavadski. But without the regime's cooperation, without access to classified records, without testimony from those involved, finding him is nearly impossible. This is the cruelest aspect of enforced disappearance. It's a crime that continues forever. The victim dies once, but the family dies a little bit every day, never knowing, never able to properly grieve, trapped in a purgatory of uncertainty. It's torture by absence. It's murder extended across decades. On July 7th each year, journalists in Belarus and around the world mark the anniversary of Dzmitry Zavadski's disappearance. They post his photograph. They retell his story. They demand accountability that never comes. These annual remembrances serve multiple purposes. They honor Dzmitry's memory.
They remind the world that Belarus is still a place where journalists disappear. And they send a message to the regime: we haven't forgotten, we're still watching. We're still documenting. Because that's what Dzmitry would have done. He would have kept filming, kept documenting, kept bearing witness, no matter the cost.
He understood that truth matters, that recording reality is an act of resistance, that someone has to stand up and say, this happened, even when powerful people would prefer that history be forgotten or rewritten. 24 years ago, a cameraman went to an airport to pick up a colleague. He parked his car, locked his doors, and walked toward the terminal. Somewhere in that short walk, he disappeared. Not into thin air, nothing supernatural about it, but into the machinery of state violence, into the apparatus of a regime that believed it could silence anyone who documented its crimes. They silenced Dzmitry Zavadski, but they couldn't silence his story. Every article written about his disappearance, every investigation conducted, every demand for justice, every photograph shared on social media, these are all acts of witness, continuations of the work he started. The camera he left in his trunk that night isn't filming anymore, but others have picked up different cameras and continued documenting. The question that opened this story remains unanswered. What really happened at Minsk National Airport on July 7, 2000? We know the broad strokes. We know who likely ordered it and who likely carried it out. We know why it happened and what it was meant to accomplish. But we don't know the precise details. We don't know Dzmitry's final moments. We don't know where he's buried. We don't know when, or if, anyone will ever be held accountable. But here's what we do know. Dzmitry Zavadski lived. He loved his family. He believed in truth. He pointed his camera at injustice and documented what we saw. And for that, he was taken from a parking lot and erased from existence by people who believed they had the power to unmake reality itself. They were wrong. You can kill a cameraman, but you can't kill what he filmed. You can disappear a journalist, but you can't disappear the stories he told. You can bury the body, but you can't bury the truth. Somewhere in Belarus, there's an unmarked grave that contains the answer to what happened to Dzmitry Zavadski. Someday, maybe not soon, maybe not in our lifetime, but someday, that grave will be found. The truth will emerge. The people responsible will be named. Justice, delayed by decades, will finally arrive. Until then, we remember, we document, we bear witness. Just like Dzmitry taught us to do. His camera is silent, but ours are not.